Thanks for coming out. I think it's going to be a really incredible evening, and the discussion tonight should be really, really great. So, my name is Adoni Malthopoulos. I'm in the interdisciplinary program here at Dalhousie. I'm also a member of Platypus, which is the group hosting this event tonight. I think most of you probably know about Platypus. We started in 2006. We're a campus-based organization, a student club here at Dalhousie, and we're devoted to asking questions about the history and current thinking on the left. And so tonight is an example of the kind of thing that we do. We do these kind of fora. Actually, in about an hour at the New School in New York, we have a very big panel going on with featuring David Harvey and a number of other people asking the question about radical interpretations of the current crisis and what it might mean. And of course, with the big strikes planned in Europe, the question is like, how does theory connect with like what we do? Which I think we'll be tackling here tonight. In about a month, we're doing another one of these with a prominent anarchist who was involved, prominently with Occupy, David Graeber, in London. So you can follow these events. If you're not already on Facebook, you'll get announcements of it, but there's like a new media page where all the media events get put up on. Finally, I think just to put the plug, this is all around campus, and we've reached 50. This is the issue 50 or 50th issue. We've been putting this open submission publication out for the past 5 years. It's meant to be the discussion of the left in print. So we like tonight, we encourage people from different aspects of the left to discuss issues. So nothing in here is like what we believe, but we want people reading this journal to sort of like have to tackle with the problems of the left. So this process of confronting what's immediately in front of us in terms of the left is a practical undertaking too. So if there are, there's a few students here, there's a few ways that you can get involved. The first is tonight. So we have this panel that's been put together by students who are members of Platypus at different campuses. And tonight you can get engaged in this conversation, listen carefully to the conversation, and try to pose questions. We've tried to put the conversation together in a specific way, which it's not going to be all the same perspective. So think about it, and your questions during the Q&A after about an hour will be very valuable to sort of completing this conversation. You can also get involved we've now switched it to Tuesdays. Tuesdays at the Second Cup at the Killam, we meet there for informal discussions about a broad range of things, what's in the PR, what's going on in the news. It's very informal, and the coffee is relatively inexpensive, so come on by. The last thing is Ryan is going to circulate a sign-in sheet. If you haven't signed in before, if you're from another campus and you want to sort of get involved with this on your campus, just indicated on that sheet. And without, I think with that we can, does this work here? Okay, so with that, let's begin. So as I mentioned, tonight's panel is one that's been conceived of by a bunch of students in Platypus thinking about this problem of democracy. And it's slated to take place in Frankfurt and Thessaloniki with plans to do it at a new chapter we're starting at Concordia, Montreal, and in New York. So Halifax is the first place this event is taking place. Now, the panel description that each of the panelists received goes as follows, and we've sort of asked them to form their opening remarks around this description. Forgive me as I read. From the financial crisis and the bank bailouts to the question of sovereign debt, from the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street, from the struggle for a unified European-wide policy to the elections in Greece and Egypt that seem to have threatened so much and promised so little, the need to go beyond mere protest has asserted itself. Political revolution is in the air. Again. At the same time, the general election in the US last week seems, by comparison, to be a non-event, despite potentially having far-reaching consequences for teeming issues worldwide. Today, the people, the demos, seem resigned to their political powerlessness, even as they rage against the corruption of politics. Hence, while contemporary demands for democracy to politicize the demos They are also indicative of social and political regression that asks urgently for recognition and reflection. Demands from democracy from below end up being expressed from above. The 99%, in its already obscure, unorganized character, didn't express itself as such in the various recent elections, but was split into various tendencies, many of them very reactionary. Democracy retains an enigmatic character. It seems ambiguous, since it always slips any fixed form and content, since people under the dynamic of capital keep demanding at times more democracy and real democracy. But democracy can be Janus-like. It often expressed both progressive, social, and emancipatory demands, but also their defeat, their hijacking by an elected Bonaparte. This reference to Napoleon Bonaparte III after uprising in 1848. What is the history informing the demands for greater democracy today? And how does the left adequately promote or not the cause of popular empowerment? What are the potential futures for democratic revolution, especially as understood by the left? Now, the questions that we've posed to I'm just going to quickly go over some of these questions that we've asked the panelists to respond to. We've asked them to consider what they would consider as real democracy, as this has been a primary demand of recent spontaneous forms of discontent from the Arab Spring all the way to the student strikes. What they consider the relationship between democracy and the working class today. Do they consider historical struggles for democracy by workers as the medium by which they got assimilated into the system, or the only path to emancipation that they couldn't avoid trying to take? We asked them to consider, is it necessary to eschew established forms of mass politics in favor of new forms in order to build a democratic movement? Or are current mass forms of politics adequate for a democratic society? Why has democracy emerged as the primary demand of spontaneous forms of discontent? Do they consider it necessary or adequate to deal with the pathologies of our era? These demands as being able to deal with these pathologies. Now, Engels wrote, "A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is." Do they agree with this? Can this conception be compatible with the struggle for democracy? How can democracy be related with the issue of possibly overcoming capital? Is there a difference between the ancient and the modern notion of democracy? And if so, what is the source of that difference? Where does that difference come from? Does real democracy share more with the direct democracy of the ancient polis? And finally, is democracy oppressive, or can it be as such? How would our panelists judge Lenin's formulation that democracy is also a state, and that consequently democracy will disappear when the state disappears? I'd like to introduce our panelists in the order that they'll be speaking tonight. John Hutton is in his final year of the International Development Studies and Economics at Dalhousie. He's a campaign coordinator here with the Dalhousie Student Union. He's a member of Solidarity Halifax, which is a pluralistic, democratic, anti-capitalist organization, quite unique in North America. John, as some of you remember, was very compelling and interesting as a speaker on our Occupy Roundtable here at Dal last fall, and I feel real fortunate to have him here join us again tonight. At the far end, we have Matthew Furlong, who is a teaching fellow in the Foundation Year program and an instructor in the Contemporary Studies program at the University of King's College, and serves as the Don of the King's Residence, North Pole Bay. He is also the president and chief negotiator of the Union of King's College Teachers Association, which represents the full-time non-professional teaching faculty at King's. Matthew received his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Guelph in 2011, his master's in philosophy from Concordia at 2006, and his bachelor in contemporary studies and philosophy from King's here in Halifax in 2003. Next to Matthew is Clare O'Connor, and Clare is, we're glad to have her come in from Toronto. She is an author and activist. She co-founded the grassroots training project Tools for Change and was a coordinator for the Ontario Public Interest Research Group at the University of Toronto between 2009 and 2012. Between 2008 and 2011, she served on the editorial committee of Upping the Ante, a journal of theory and action. Her publications include a chapter in Whose Streets, the Toronto G20 and the Challenges of the Summit Protest, entitled What Moves Us Now, The Contradictions of Community, And on that note, Claire is also going to be on a panel tomorrow evening over across the street at the Adachi Theater on the limits of local, and I'd encourage you to come and hear her talk on a very different panel tomorrow night. And to round things out, we have David Howard from across town. He's an associate professor of art history in the Division of Historical and Critical Studies at NSCAD. He has published numerous articles and essays on history, culture, and the politics of modernism and postmodernism in the United States and Canada after World War II, and most recently has published several of his critical allegorical texts in the journals Counterexample Poetics, Retort, and Left Curve, including Progress in an Age of Rigor Mortis, Canada's Expo 67, and The Triumph of American Liberalism. His newest text, Campanero, is an excerpt of his recently completed book manuscript titled The Day of the Dogs, and we published in the next issue of Left Curve. David is also featured in this month's edition of the Platypus Review, which you can pick up at the back. It was a book review that was focused broadly on the question of democracy. That whole issue was sort of focused on the question of democracy, and his review of Negativity and Revolution, Adorno, and Political Activism, I encourage you to read it. So we're going to begin here with the opening remarks. We'll start with John, over to Matthew, Claire, and then finish off with David. I'm going to be very ruthless with the timing. I think it would be nice for us to finish at 9 p.m., so I can assure you I will have us out at the door by 9 p.m. And if you're interested, we can, in carrying this conversation on, we can move over to the grad house at that time. Okay. So, John, without further ado, take it away.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out to this discussion. My name is John Hutton, as Andoni mentioned. I'm born and raised here in Halifax. I'm an economics and international development student here at Dal. And I've been engaged in social movements since I graduated from high school. So that means I've been involved in a great diversity of causes, but I'm wearing some hats tonight, and that is as my role as campaign coordinator for Dalhousie Student Union, as a member of Solidarity Halifax. I'm really interested in tonight's discussion because it gets to the root of my politics. That is, democracy is one of those words that everyone identifies with. It universally means good, even if we don't actually practice it. Most people think we have it, and think that those that don't have it would benefit from it. And one Middle Eastern occupation at a time, we're trying to spread it. I want to start by looking at the relationship between democracy and the broader population. Here in Canada, we have a federal parliamentary system where we have 3 overlapping governments, and we vote for a representative to municipal, provincial, and federal levels. They enter government if there's more of their party than anybody else's. And this is what we're told democracy is. It's voting. The majority of people, democracy means voting for government. It hasn't always been that way. And there are people that try to expand the definition, but these are the conditions that we're currently working under. We have some democracy, but I don't think that we're a complete democracy. The economy, for example, is not democratic. When's the last time you voted for your boss? It's not democratic on a national level, nor is the globalized system in which we're integrated. As we know, our ability to survive in the world depends on our activity in the economy, and yet the vast majority of people are denied any meaningful participation in economic decision-making. We live in a capitalist society, and that means that people own productive technology, and they hire workers that are paid a wage to make that technology turn inputs into valuable commodities. The worker gets paid significantly less value than that which they've created, and the owner is very rarely an essential or even useful part of this process. Real democracy, as the panel discussion is asking what it is, requires that everyone that produces wealth has a meaningful say in how that wealth is allocated. Real democracy requires that institutions and economic engines are run as a collective project of stakeholders where all have a voice and an ability to change things. And this is a very powerful, motivating force for people. Workers rarely form trade unions over wages, pensions, or benefits. The most common reason that workers put their jobs on the line is to win respect at work. Think with that. Personally, I find it easy to believe. It reflects the powerlessness that workers experience under capitalism and the union, which is a democratic collective formation, offers that empowerment. Now, there have been movements throughout history to get us to that point of participatory budgeting and cooperative management. For obvious reasons, owners of capital oppose it. But movements have often grown in size and momentum despite fierce, often violent resistance from capital. Concessions are then necessary to preserve stability. Where possible, those in power will use the language of their opposition to validate their power. The United States is a good example of this, where social movements, unlike most of the democratic West, failed to create a labor party like other capitalist countries. Instead, the union movement was absorbed into the Liberal Party, the Democrats. As a result, they get to choose between Republicans and Democrats, two parties that are inseparably tied to Wall Street in the military-industrial complex, two cheeks of the same ass. This Labor-Democrat alliance has been a disaster for American workers. The failure to create a working-class political pole has kept America behind most of the world. They have more advanced privatization, they have weaker labor standards, they have no universal health care, they have a pathetic public school system, and $1 trillion student debt bubble. Civil society creates social and economic change, and democracy is the oxygen that stokes the flames. But where civil society cannot win greater democracy, the working class suffers. Democracy has a paradoxical character to it for two reasons. First, we can't achieve it without using it. Second, we have to implement it first, without necessarily getting popular consent. I'll get back to that. We need in our movements, if we ever want to implement it, we need democracy in our movements if we ever want to see it implemented on a larger scale. We cannot implement a system based on collective ownership without having public debates about goals, strategies, and tactics. If people feel that they're voiceless within a movement, they're more likely to stay at home or split to form a different group, and that's not effective organizing. The second point that I made is in relation to creating democracy. You have to assume it's the way to make fair decisions. The economist Amartya Sen would compare the issues of authoritarianism and starvation in the world. Tens of thousands of people dying daily from starvation, shouldn't that be a bigger priority than democracy? This is a contradictory argument, however. You can't assume that starving people in authoritarian countries want you only to worry about food security. The only way to know that's what they want, to focus on starvation, is if you ask them, and that sounds surprisingly democratic. Sen would point out that famines haven't happened in democratic countries. The countries which have had the more effective mass movements for economic democracy, such as Venezuela or Bolivia, are the ones that have seen poverty rates, illiteracy rates, infant mortality rates, and most negative health and social measures become dramatically better. In Venezuela, social movements won the ability to form community councils, which have been a more effective governance model for community building than a distant municipal government. Through a process of transferring economic power from capitalists to democratic worker-run cooperatives, extreme poverty has been cut by more than half in the last 10 years. Some municipalities have even gone so far as to do their budgets by popular participation and votes. Not only will the community's resources be distributed more fairly, but people feel much more engaged in their institutions. It's a fascinating process. Economic democracy is Economic democracy is often more capable of creating substantial change than voting for politicians. Through the ability to collectively withdraw consent from economic activity, change can be forced. It was a national strike by the Canadian Union of Postal Workers that made maternity leave a reality in Canada, not enlightened politicians. Hosni Mubarak was not toppled from power in Egypt until a general strike was declared. The student movement in Quebec did not defeat tuition hikes and anti-protest laws by lobbying. They used the democratic processes in their unions and voted to strike, throwing a wrench in the state machinery. Further, the ability of Quebec's student federations to win their strike was through the highly democratic structures and practices they have. The unions in Quebec are more decentralized than here at Dal, for example. While the Dal Student Union tries and fails to represent 17,000 students, Quebec student unions are only representative of departments. So instead of having one student union on campus, you'll have multiple small ones. And these are where the strike votes would take place. There's a reason that hundreds of thousands of students participated in that process in Quebec, while the Dal Student Union struggles to get 20% voter turnout in elections. And during the strikes, they regularly checked in with their membership to renew support for striking. It's thoroughly democratic. The structure makes it more relevant to students, the process is more participatory, and the act of making demands and not backing down brings power to the people, which is literally what democracy means. And so that would conclude my contribution to tonight's discussion. Democracy is more than just having a vote for our leaders. It's having meaningful, regular engagement in decision-making, particularly around the economy. Democracy is not just a nice idea that's separate from economic or social needs. It creates the space for civil society to organize and attain them. Democracy is the rule by the people, and only when social movements are active and engaging with institutions of power can it be considered to exist. Democracy is the most effective way to build the civil society organizations that advocate for a better way. It's both the process and the goal. So thanks for listening. I look forward to your questions and the other panelists. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, as Andoni said, my name is Matthew Furlong. I teach at King's, and I don't represent anybody. There's a whole galaxy of problems that I could try to tackle tonight, but in the interest of time and not irritating everyone, I'm just going to keep it down to two possible sort of lines in thinking about this concept of democracy and this reality of democracy. So first, I'm concerned about the notion of real democracy, so which we've been asked to talk about. To my mind, democracy refers to a kind of deliberative or decision-making machine or mechanism. Both the objects of deliberation and the presupposition that form those objects can be varied. As the morally dubious Carl Schmitt writes in his nonetheless astute analysis from 1923, The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, quote, "The various nations or social and economic groups who organize themselves, quote-unquote, democratically, have the same subject, quote-unquote, the people, only in the abstract. A democracy can be militarist or pacifist, absolutist or liberal, centralized or decentralized, progressive or reactionary, and again different at different times, without ceasing to be a democracy. What remains then of democracy? For its definition, one has a string of identities. It belongs to the essence of democracy that every and all decisions which are taken are only valid for those who themselves decide. That the outvoted minority must be ignored in this only causes theoretical and superficial difficulties. In reality, even this rests on the identity that constantly recurs in democratic logic and on the essential democratic argument, as will be seen immediately, that the will of the outvoted minority is in truth identical with the will of the majority." Unquote. With this last claim, Schmitt recapitulates Jean-Jacques Rousseau's argument that the ethical attitude proper to the general democratic will is that the losers in democratic decision-making processes will their loss insofar as it is brought about through democracy itself. This is the meaning, for example, that of many people's irritating remark after Stephen Harper's majority victory last year, seems like a lifetime ago, that democracy had won, even though the Canadian people had lost. In other words, taken in its own right, in my view, democracy is real when decisions are made democratically, that is, by the demos and according to the chosen manner of deliberation. And I want to emphasize the circularity of this definition. In ancient Greece, for example, democracy pertains to the agonistic relationship of equals in the polis, freedom considered as non-slavery to others and to oneself, the legacy and life of the city, and the opening up of the agora as a place in which free men can meet and freely speak to each other are some of the concerns that underpin democracy for the Greeks. In Republican Rome, for example, we see the importance of the polis intensified in figures like Cato the Younger, for whom the republic and its laws are divine. And here I'll introduce my second problem. I'm concerned, and this relates to what I just said about free men and free speech, right? I'm concerned about the relationship of the concept of freedom to the concept in the political exercise of democracy. For us, the legacy of 17th and particularly 18th century liberalism is much closer than that of Athenian democracy. It is true that liberal democracy, so-called, revolves around the notion of liberty, for which we sometimes substitute the word freedom. Montesquieu, in his monolithic work, The Spirit of the Laws, talks about liberty in this way. Quote, "It is true that in democracies," he says, "that in democracies the people seem to do what they want. But political liberty in no way consists in doing what one wants. In a state, that is, in a society where there are laws, that is, for Montesquieu, a republic, sort of what I mean is that it's possible to imagine democracy that runs by plebiscites and doesn't emphasize the rule of law. Right? So in a society where there are laws, liberty can exist only in having the power to do what one should want to do, and in no way being constrained to do what one should not want to do, end quote. For this reason, for Montesquieu, the object of education in a republic is virtue. And what is virtue? Quote, virtue in a republic, says Montesquieu, is a very simple thing. It is love of the republic. It is a feeling and not a result of knowledge. Love of the homeland leads to goodness and mores leads to love of the homeland. The less we can satisfy our particular passions, the more we give ourselves up to passions for the general order. Why do monks so love their order? Their love comes from the same thing that makes the order intolerable to them. Their rule deprives them of everything upon which ordinary passions rest. What remains, therefore, is the passion for the very rule that afflicts them. The more austere it is, that is, the more it curtails their inclinations, the more force it gives to those who remain. End quote. I point out this sequence of concepts, liberty, virtue, love, spiritual austerity, and so on, to indicate how 18th century liberal democracy rests on a whole understanding of the order of things, what I'm tempted to call a cosmic or cosmopolitical understanding, and to suggest that today we have departed so far from such presuppositions that our relationship to even this more recent form of political thinking may be no less strange to us than that of our relationship to the ancients. What's more, I think we've departed from this understanding in ways that may directly undermine it. For example, we no longer consider freedom or liberty to mean the power of what one should want to do, which is a political interpretation of a philosophical concept of freedom that goes back at least to St. Augustine. If we look at someone like Isaiah Berlin, for example, the meaning of freedom is confined to what are called positive and negative liberties, i.e. those things which we are permitted to do and those ways in which we mutually constrain ourselves from interfering in each other's positive liberties. I think that these two senses of liberty today correspond to what might be called a common sense understanding, but neither of them is of the order of Montesquieu's concept. And it's this concept, in fact, that permeates and underpins the 18th century thinkers in one way or another, such as Rousseau, Kant, and Maximilian Robespierre, for that matter. In a nutshell, I'm not sure that without this concept of freedom, we can have a democratic politics that will permit us to combat the dominating effects of political parties, for example. So I think I'm already beyond the word limit. But I just wanted to flag those issues, even though that's just me, like not even scratching the surface of the issues I'm talking about, what I'm not talking about. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you both for the talks, and thanks for having me here tonight. It's my first time in Halifax. And so far, you seem lovely. Yeah, and it's a little wet. I'm going to join you, and I've already forgotten your name, tragically.
Matthew.
Matthew. I'm going to join Matthew in taking kind of as my object the idea that democracy is a self-evident good thing. So maybe we'll have some debate later on. But I want to start with the concept itself, and I agree this is such a short amount of time to deal with all the problems that we've been presented. So the word democracy, I think, denotes two things simultaneously, and we have to keep both in mind as we have this conversation. One meaning, and the one most frequently mobilized by people on the left, is rule of the people. And this is the conceptual foundation for leftist models of participatory democracy, such as the experiment with the Occupy movement, which is going to be one example I try to unpack. The other meaning, which I think leftists scrutinize much less frequently, is how the people shall be ruled. And this is the conceptual foundation for representational state democracy. And our zone of struggle, I mean, I always telling friends like, oh, well, on the 14th I'm doing the communist talk, and then on the 15th I'm doing the academic talks. But I don't know how much to take for granted with this audience. But assuming we're all here because we share some commitment to anti-capitalist struggle, I think we have to identify the zone of struggle as the tension between these two conceptions of democracy, each of which contains its own contradictions. So I'm going to talk about each. In our navigation of the latter conception, that is, how the people shall be ruled, I think anti-capitalists and radicals find ourselves reliant on premises that we simultaneously critique. Right? So these prominently include, more than what I'm going to talk about, but prominently include the notion of democratic freedom, and the politics of demand. So, for example, radicals' direct confrontations with state power very regularly turn to calls for freedom of speech and dissent, despite our awareness that these premises are actually legitimating factors for state capitalism. And to highlight this dynamic of legitimization, Slavoj Žižek, who's a Slovenian Marxist philosopher and has already been slammed on this panel in the small talk teased before the event began, cites George W. Bush's reaction to being greeted in London with mass protests against his visit by saying that the protests were what we were fighting for in Iraq, right? So you see, we're fighting for Iraqis' right to protest their own government policy. So, and indeed, the state typically uses popular protest as a kind of weather balloon to figure out how best to sell whatever line makes it possible to preserve constituted power. And while protest is occasionally successful at forcing revisions in policy and education, it's very rarely strong enough to transform policy objectives. We watch this happen, but often for very legitimate tactical reasons, nonetheless place demands on constituted power in an effort to mitigate harm and disenfranchisement. And while reliance on a politics of demand is understandable, in part because it's difficult to conceive of alternatives, and in part because actually existing democracy affords some of us rather comfortable spaces within which to, say, talk about what democracy is. This reliance not only legitimates constituted power, but more importantly, can become an obstacle to us devising strategies that push further. Notably, the logical conclusion of this model finds really clear expression in the labor movement, which I'd actually contest is not consistently democratic, which now explicitly demands, and I don't know if this has happened here, it demands respect from constituted power. What a kind of absurd thing. And one thing I thought I'd mention is that during protests against the austerity agenda proposed by our Toronto's Conservative mayor, Rob Ford, labor union, like people within organized labor, were carrying banners that read, "We are not the enemy," which seemed like a clear expression of how bad it is. Of course, if we're in a war, then it's a war on workers and the poor, then of course we're the enemy. We ought to be. The former conception of democracy, the rule of the people, inspires models of horizontalism that reveal distinct, but I think equally serious, strategic problems. Specifically, radicals find ourselves without a clear sense of A, who the people are, and B, what is the force that the people need to become in order to actually contest the sovereignty of constituted power. So the Occupy movement is a case in point. And I want to say from the outset that I think the movement has been extremely generative in all kinds of ways, and I contributed to the Toronto camp as best I could, and I was pretty disappointed with how many anti-capitalists actually disavowed the movement from the outset and didn't really participate. But I can see that I only made it through 3 Occupy Toronto General Assemblies before concluding that it was at best a forum for very slowly making administrative decisions, not for making political ones. And moreover, the assembly model, especially the fetishized people's mic, which was very popular in Occupy, functioned mainly as a vehicle for the collective affirmation of assumed truths, not the production of new truths or the scrutiny of existing truths. So, I have this the speaker says, "We are the 99%, and everybody else is like, "We are the 99%. What is this thing?" So in this movement that had no demand, so that had gotten away from tried to get away from these standard problems, and a movement that was so dedicated to rejecting constituted power and specifically facilitating debate for the long-term goal of self-governance, anti-capitalist, communist, anarchist, everybody I kind of recognize as in that sphere in Toronto, resorted to practices of strategic intervention that were more or less based on kind of cadre models, right? So I worked with several others to organize an educational workshop series in the park called the 99%, and I got people who I trust to facilitate open conversations about labor unions and finance capital and imperialism and foreign policy, etc. Other comrades of mine deliberated within their revolutionary organizations and then tried to pull assembly decisions to the left, but found it similarly difficult. Sometimes the workshops went well, sometimes people were able to affect the assembly decisions, but largely it was really complicated. There were massive, massive disagreements and disputes, and not necessarily about things that pushed political discussions into new territory. Even the successes that we had served to highlight that democracy, while a kind of an understandable, important moral premise under current conditions of such grave disenfranchisement, doesn't have self-evident implications for revolutionary strategy. It's not a self-evident good thing in the effort to, say, bring about a social organization that's just. Moreover, and this is a thing I wish I had more time to talk about it, and maybe we can get into it later, I think the movement's strategic and ideological repetition of the claim that this was real democracy did very little to clarify how the rule of the people would be organized to contest constituted powers, sovereignty to determine how the people shall be ruled. So there are a lot of questions that follow from there, but that's what I've got. Thank you.
David.
Okay. Well, I blame Adani for me being here because I'm a fish out of water. I never would have thought in my life that I'd be speaking on a panel about democracy. I'm not a democratic theorist. I have very little overt political background, aside from the fact that I was born into the working class, and my family has a tradition steeped in the foundations of the CCF. And I've always been on the left wing of the Canadian political spectrum. No matter how far to the right it goes, I keep trying to go farther left, but it keeps spinning wildly to the right, which I resent deeply. Anyway, this paper is going to be different, and bear with me. It's going to seem abstract and it's going to seem different from what the other panelists have talked about. But what I hope comes out a little bit in the paper, and maybe comes out in the discussion, is how something that seems so abstract is actually very pertinent to a discussion about democracy and a discussion about where does radical politics and maybe radical art practice come together and contribute to one another, or maybe not come together and go off in different directions because they do not see eye to eye. So bear with me, and I'm sure you'll have questions asking for clarification, because I'm throwing everything in here at you in the kitchen sink to boot, so I apologize for that. For 20 years I've been teaching social art history of the 19th and 20th century art, theory and criticism, and NSCAD. This means that I'm looking at art in the context of its social, historical, and political context, especially in the way art has functioned as an important expression of the social and cultural dominance of the emerging bourgeois society in the capitalist heartland of Western Europe in the 19th century. This means looking at the points of contact and resistance between the emerging capitalist order and those individuals and groups in society who have resisted this capitalist hegemony in the name of an alternate vision of society that was neither backward-looking nor naively accepting of the new definitions of social progress or democracy offered up by liberal capitalism. The revolutionary wave that swept across Europe in 1848, and that was by and large crushed by 1851, was quickly supplanted by new mechanisms of ideological and cultural control that sought to replace the democratic idea of the citizen with a less troublesome and more profitable notion of the consumer. This transition we are living in the fallout of today, and this discussion needs to be taken into account when we talk about the relationship between ideology, democracy, and politics. The shift from citizen to consumer is perhaps best symbolized in Western culture by the 1851 Crystal Palace World's Fair in London and the 1855 World's Fair in Paris, which supplanted the more rowdy and dangerous concepts of the festival and the fair, which in European history were notorious hotbeds for fomenting radical politics and revolution. So these new institutions arose with an all-encompassing pedagogical motivation, which was successful, which was to spread the gospel of the benefits of globalized trade and colonial exploitation. Both externally, we all know about this, but what is not talked about enough is how this colonial exploitation was pushed internally as a form of psychological exploitation of both the bourgeois and the proletarian subconscious in a new phantasm of consumerism. What quickly emerged across Europe and the Western world was a complex series of mechanisms culminating in what the Hegelian Marxist and the leader of the situationist avant-garde in France, Guy Debord, would later refer to as the colonization of the subconscious by the society of the spectacle, that demonstrated that capitalism was far more ruthless, mediated, and sophisticated than had previously been understood by most artists, poets, and philosophers. Indeed, the ability of capitalism to neutralize radical challenges to its authority and its very existence helped to motivate Karl Marx and the poet Charles Baudelaire to launch their virtually simultaneous critiques of capitalism from their respective critical vantage points. Capitalism was becoming much more supple, more sophisticated in its ability to mediate contradictions, to placate its more moderate foes, and to co-opt many of its most radical opponents by playing what is known as the gaps, a strategy that now today is called by the Harvard cultural theorist Homi Bhabha a strategy of articulating, a strategy of playing the gaps, which is a way that neoliberal capitalism can neutralize dissent. For poets like Baudelaire, language itself was now identified as a key field of struggle, over which the ability to articulate a counter-discourse or a counter-imaginary to capitalism could be fought over. I would argue that this counter-imaginary rooted in an allegorical poetics of resistance, that it was opposed to this new cultural dominant of the symbolic within capitalism. And this symbolic is a rooting together or a joining together of both Romanticism and Neoclassicism. And remember that Marxist aesthetic was rooted in Neoclassicism under the banners of eternal beauty and taste. To this day forms one of the most powerful instruments for undercutting the linguistic foundations of groups critical of the status quo, whether they're democratic or not. And this argument I would also apply to the ecology movement or any arguments about sustainability. The art world has been a barometer of the hopes and fears facing Western intellectuals for over the last 150 years. Calls to integrate art into life in the name of either a radical sublimation or overcoming of the alienation generated by liberal capitalism have jostled uneasily with loud calls for equality in art, to defend itself by withdrawal into the ivory tower, where it could, according to some, who I vehemently disagree with, best resist the calls for art's instrumentalization by voices on the left and the right. Indeed, after World War II, abstract expressionism and the avant-garde became synonymous with defending American vital center liberalism and democracy against the extremism of the left and the right. The co-optation and the integration of the avant-garde and modernism into the establishment led to the flourishing of postmodernism in North America, which enabled in the last several decades a supposedly more democratic expression of multiple voices and communities to gain expression in the art world. Just as identity politics helped to break the stranglehold of the European Enlightenment with its universalizing pretensions and open the door to a renewal of certain forms of democratic expression. This was in part a reassertion of the allegorical over the symbolic co-optation and manipulation of modernism and the avant-garde by Cold War liberals. Now, what was problematic about this conflict was the emphasis on fragmentation, and particularly within the postmodern movement, this could not help but undermine Marxism and virtually all of its manifestations, leaving this resistance vulnerable to co-optation by a neoliberalism that was emerging in the 1970s after the downfall of modernism. For the last half-century, North America, if not the entire capitalist heartland, has been living through an ongoing counter-revolution, determined to crush the vestiges of the political radicalism of the old and new left of the 20th century. Democracy has been formalized around an election process and political parties that offer no alternative to capitalism and betray a complete lack of political imagination. Capitalism is accepted as the norm for operating in contemporary life, and the social democratic movement has withered to the point where it now shares many of the same basic ideologies as neoliberalism. Now, for me, the key point is that language itself now has deteriorated more rapidly to the point that we have raced well beyond George Orwell's 1984, and I would argue we have lost sight of the critical insights into language and poetics from the mid-19th and early 20th centuries. I'm going to wrap this up quickly. I would argue that the linguistic capitulation to capitalism is one of the many telltale symptoms of an increasingly authoritarian, if not totalitarian, society. In an interview published in Platypus this month, the great American philosopher and theologian Cornel West, who is also a student of the work of George Lukács and the Frankfurt School, argues, quote, "Now we are just trying to keep alive the critique of capitalism, the critique of imperialism, and the critique of white supremacy. We have such a dumbed-down public discussion that nowadays people hardly even engage in a serious critique of the system," end quote. I would argue that art is one of the vital elements of engaging in this serious critique of the system and promoting a more democratic society. However, current economic and political pressures are once again creating a push towards the ivory tower or towards the street. Theory as opposed to practice. Form as opposed to content, or the reverse. For me, some of the most important roles for art in a society like ours is to keep alive the critique of capitalism, the critique of the military, educational, industrial complex, and the critique of social injustice. But above all, contemporary modern art must question itself. What is its role in capitalism? What is its role in furthering democracy? If not, why? And if it wants to show how it does pursue, and it must show how it does pursue this. And I would argue in a culture where the symbolic use of language remains hegemonic and consequently an impediment to the full exercise of citizenship and democracy, the legacy of Allegory and its tenuous relationship to Marxism and radical aesthetics, especially in the work of a scholar like Walter Benjamin, should be examined as one of the most powerful combinations of art, theory, and politics to have come out of the last 160 years of Western thought. The end.
Thank you very much. Those were wonderful presentations, and I think there's considerable points of agreement, but I also think there's ways in which there's disagreement. I have one thing I just want to sort of like throw into the panel, and we'll also take some questions from the floor. I'll give you a second to digest what you've just heard and come up with a question. One thing that I'm interested in is there seems to be a way in which I think all four speakers have a sense that democracy in its present form has become an end in itself and needs to be troubled and questioned. But there seems to be ways in which each of you think about it differently. I mean, one notion that might be interesting to sort of bring up, and I was thinking about this as I was listening to Matthew speak, is a way in which like liberalism at a certain point had a conception of its role to civil society. I think JD also brought up the question of like a better relation of civil society to the world, what that would look like, and you had some examples. The interesting thing is I think that might be missed is that liberals themselves have a notion of the withering away of the state. It's not simply Marxist. There's a way in which like that early liberalism, in some ways, democracy might have even seemed unnecessary because these things would be adjudicated at the level of civil society. And the way in which the state sort of like becomes subsequently over the 19th century maybe shocking to many early liberals. And I'm kind of interested in how each of you sort of think about that transition. And specifically, I think there's like something that is coming into this conversation. JD brings in the workers' movement. David, you bring in this transition of like citizen to consumer. And it's sort of subsequently following on this conversation of 1848. And subsequently, which is interesting because the politics of the workers' movement is post-1848. So this whole latter part of the 19th century is where the workers' movement and the unions and this whole the social democratic
Anarchism, Marxism,
this is
all emerges.
So I mean, there's kind of like a strange way in which like the transition from citizen to consumer is taking place at the very same time the left is sort of like coming into forms that we come to recognize it, and like the workers are becoming democratic subjects within the system. So I wanted to bring in this idea of like what's happening during this time, how things have taken this transformation. I mean, it had some correspondence with Matthew earlier. There seems a clear way which you can sort of like ascribe it to conservatives in the present, but clearly this problem goes back, and there's a way in which like worker democracy in some ways is like tied together with this problem of how democracy appears to us. In a way that to liberals early on, this notion of democracy and like having representation at the state would almost seem kind of foreign to them. And the question's kind of obscure, but I just wanted to bring in this question of dates and sort of like how this is ratcheting up, because the workers' movement is emerging at a time when there seems to be these transitions, this whole idea of like politics as an end in itself, like the actual machine politics, the Democratic Party itself, only takes its form after the Civil War, and sort of like, so I'd like you to all reflect upon how you understand we've gotten to the present. Let's think about this a little bit.
Next panel discussion.
I wanted to think about how, let's simplify this down in terms of how we might think of like the state and sort of democracy in its current forms. It's like a cancer, right? It's like a real problem. Like we just need to sort of like wash it away and reveal like real civil society. Or to what extent the state that we sort of envision is symptomatic of society. It is like, you couldn't simply like have participatory democracy roll out. You actually would have to have forms of mediation. It's not just like if you had democracy at the workplace, that would be insufficient, because that social production, you would think would be everybody should have a say in that, not just the workers. I mean, there would be the free press or things like this. These are all forms of the way in which society articulates that is subsequent, but you can't just, wash it all away, or can you?
Well, isn't the central question that can you have democracy and capitalism? Can you have a real democracy and have capitalism at the same time?
But then your premise is that real democracy is a self-evident good thing.
I think but it depends on how you define. I mean, when we look at capitalism, and one of the things that we're talking about here, well, what I'm talking about in my paper, is this eruption of this idea of consumerism, but it's also the adjacent concepts of commodity fetishism and reification that percolates throughout the whole system. So in a sense, how can you have a legitimate democracy in a certain sense when you have a system that is permeated by values at both the conscious and the unconscious level? It's like, when Max Weber talks about a society that is becoming more alienated from itself, we're moving into this iron cage. I mean, it seems like a very odd thing to try and say that you have democracy while you're living in a cage. Don't you have to get out of the cage first?
A sort of related question, because of what you were saying about artists not retreating into theory, but having real political content. And I'm wondering, sort of, in the context of living as an artist, how one would arrive at the decisions of what that content must look like, or must express. I think this gets at what you're saying, that like there's a premise there that we're fighting for something, and if art is expressing that, then like, what is it trying to express?
Right, but see, when you phrase it that way, there's the danger. And what I try to warn about in the paper is the eternal pull of people who are politically focused on bringing about change, wanting art to have the right content. And there's the reaction against many in the art community to say, what really matters is that art protect itself from the demands of people politically involved, to protect form, because that's the essence of art. And the difficult position I'm trying to negotiate here, and why I think this is important for thinking about democracy, is not trying to side with one side of the equation or the other, but an allegorical politics would be trying to look at both sides of the equation and keeping them both alive in the same object. So the way art is dealing with a crisis of representation, just like democracy is dealing with a crisis of representation. So the way to approach the crisis of representation is not to, I think, retreat into the same old tried and true methods of one side of the binary or the other, which is what the art world seems to be doing. It wants to impale itself on, we got to change the world. Well, how do you reach the masses? You reach them with the correct content. You don't use complex form because that's only going to confuse the content. And then you have artists retreating into the most abstract forms of art because they see art being instrumentalized, and to them instrumentalization means fascism. And so both of those tendencies need to be fought against, and I would argue the same thing in political theory. So that's where I see the art world and the democratic theoretical world coming together and maybe interacting with one another. But to think allegorically is very problematic because it makes you a lot of enemies.
I mean, maybe I can pose the question a little bit more clearly now that you've said that.
Good.
It seems as though there's a way in which, like, the emergence of the workers' movement within capitalism, because the workers' movement is not at the outset of capitalism, it sort of emerges, puts pressure on this whole question in a way that's confusing, because without the workers' movement, you wouldn't have a consumer society either. There's a way in which the workers' movement has many kind of facets of it, and can. So I guess the thing is like it seems like this question of like, in a society where chronic unemployment becomes like a function of the society, it puts pressure on the question of democracy. It almost generates new forms of democracy. And so like the way in which, for example, Matthew would see the emergence of, I'd actually like to hear Matthew speak a little bit more about the question of freedom and liberalism and democracy as having, and how it's been forgotten in a way that we forget it. We can't even, it becomes very easy for us to sort of take the ancients and the classical notions of democracy and blend them because of a way in which like that period just is completely obscure to us. And I think the interesting thing about your paper was to try and like resituate what that moment was of how liberals would have conceived of it and how that is so foreign to us. I'd like to hear you speak a little bit more about it, but I'd also like to hear some of the other panelists sort of reflect on the rise of the workers' movement specifically and how it conditions democracy through the 19th century.
So would you like me to begin by speaking about the concept of freedom?
Why don't you just maybe, I really would love to hear you speak just for an hour more, but just in terms of why is it so important to recover the moment of which, that moment specific of sort of classic liberalism? Like how's that functioning in your talk? Why do we need to sort of like understand its moment?
Well, for one thing, I think that the sort of prevailing sense of the word freedom for me today seems to be freedom conceived as a kind of license to act. Rousseau addresses this, Kant addresses this, Montesquieu addresses this, I would say even Nietzsche addresses this, St. Augustine addresses this, and Plato addresses this, and they all know that that is one way of conceiving freedom, and they all know that they see it as being inferior. The reason, and Rousseau sums it up quite nicely, and I'll paraphrase pretty liberally, no pun intended, but basically there's kind of an epistemological problem with conceiving of freedom as license as any kind of freedom worth talking about. And it's because when you consider freedom as license, that is to say like the freedom to consume, you can't tell the difference between freedom and addiction or freedom and compulsion. And therefore we should abandon this as freedom. Freedom for someone like Rousseau is when you know the difference between whether you're acting freely or whether you're being compelled by something. And now this opens up a whole really complicated discussion about, well, how do you come to know that you're acting freely? Now, Kant has an answer to this, right? And all sorts of people have different answers to this, and there's not enough time to talk about all of it. But simply, so this conception of freedom as a kind of license is perfectly compatible with consumerism, and it's perfectly compatible with, for instance, ways of responding to environmental problems by saying, oh, well, the earth will heal itself when we're gone, so we might as well just continue to follow human nature, which is to consume, and then just annihilate ourselves, and when we're gone, everything will go back to normal, which would be the most embarrassing extinction in the history of the universe. But it's not just that. I think there's sort of a more sort of mechanical thing to talk about here, which is simply that we need to take account of the fact that this is the conception of freedom that underpinned these institutions, right, and these sort of mechanisms as they understood them, and we need to ask ourselves, well, can this work without this conception of freedom, right? I'm not so sure that we can, right? And now there's another side of this, right, which is that I find it very interesting that if you go back to Thomas Hobbes, and then go all the way down from Hobbes through all these guys who were sort of taught about in school in some vague way as underpinning our parliamentary democracy, the thing that is left out of all those explanations of parliamentary democracy is like, well, what do you do, as Hobbes said, when you have a bad sovereign, right? Well, the first thing you do is try to figure out if you really do have a bad sovereign, because Hobbes is very timid and he doesn't want to get into a fight. But then, I mean, so you can put up with it, or you can back out of the social contract and go to war. And everyone from Hobbes to the American revolutionaries, all of these guys know that. And without that kind of release valve, you will wind up with a tyranny, they say. So when I was in high school and I asked, well, what am I supposed to do effective if we have a bad sovereign? Didn't know that word at that time, but you know what I mean. I was told, well, vote. Well, what if they're all shitbags? You know, well, no, what if they're actually all evil or something? Well, you run for office yourself and join a party, right? And then when we know all about the problems with party discipline, right? So I think, like, for me, you know, what's been lost is this sort of spiritual austerity that Montesquieu is talking about, in which, like, in a way, your life isn't even important. And we live in a time in which survival is the most important thing that we can think of, right? The reason why the war on terror sold so well is because people just would like to live another day more than almost anything that they can imagine. And if we don't see and accept something more important than ourselves as a good that we know, then we're pretty much, in my view, doomed to tyranny, I guess. So this doesn't touch upon the discussion of capitalism at all, I don't think. Or maybe tangentially it does, but I think that if, you know, you see polls all the time or whatever, you ask people, would you give up your present level of comfort to help people in the rest of the world? And people say no. And that's perfectly compatible with the freedom that we're told to pursue. So I don't know if that's helpful at all. I'm not happy.
It's very grim. It's very grim. And I mean, I feel a little underprepared to answer this question, but I'm kind of compelled to respond to a couple of the points you brought up. I think when you were talking about this idea of freedom being a license to act, the implication is that there's some limitation of the license. Right? That would be the sovereign.
No, I think the way I was thinking of it was more that I tend to read more like the libertarian argument versus that the self-ownership of the self is self-evident. So you own yourself? That's interesting, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's weird. I don't understand that. And so, you know, in a way, there's this quasi, like crypto sort of theological or something argument that's like, no, my license is just directly, my desires are just directly given license. And insofar as there is a government, the government's job is to make that happen, right? And provide some sort of like minimal safeguard against fraud or something like that. But the job of government is to get out of the way and let human nature do its thing. Mm-hmm. Insofar as we accept human nature to be about just eating things, I guess. I guess I'm thinking about it more in terms of the sort of, it seems to me there seems to be like that there's an assumption that's pretty widely held that the sovereign is already individual,
There's an assumption in this society that sovereign is already individual.
The individual is already sovereign, rather, and that the sovereignty of the individual is compromised when the individual's ability to act on his or her desires is interfered with.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I have thoughts, but
Let's bring a few questions
Yeah.
into the conversation so we can get it, please.
Let someone else go.
Yeah. This question's for Dr. Furlong. You just said that if we don't see something more important than ourselves, then we're doomed to fall into this tyranny. So I'm sort of wondering what this something more important than the self we need to look for is. And then I guess I still don't understand what freedom is. I know you talked about it a lot, but so from what I understand from what you said, freedom's not positive or negative freedom. It's not freedom as license, but it's knowing the difference between whether you're being compelled to do something or whether you're truly free. So I feel like I still don't know what freedom is.
Well, for Montesquieu, politically, freedom is the power to do what you should want to do, and to not be constrained from what you should not want to do. And I said that
so
for
the
me,
power to do the right thing.
Yeah, right. So today, in which opinion is God, that is not an easy discussion to have. I can you just get out from behind Chris's head so I can see? Okay. No, I was So I know that for me there's a kind of association there with someone like Augustine, right? So what's Augustine's problem? Is that we're born into some ways he's almost just like Freud in some ways. And that's really interesting that Neil Robertson would step on my throat if he heard me say this.
Before or after the conversion?
Well, the way that he understands human beings is constituted as willing, choosing beings, right? Desiring beings. And he says, when I'm a baby, I'm evil because, if it's there, I'm after it. And if a baby was the size of an adult, it would just kill everyone in its path, right? So it needs to be, its desire needs to come under some form of governance. And for Augustine, the meaning of the freedom of the will is when the will comes into contact with the good that it recognizes, when it recognizes the good, and then it's free to do the right thing. Is that a possibility for us today? I don't know, right? But what I am trying to say is that there's a connection between that sort of philosophical or spiritual or theological sense of freedom in Augustine and this sort of political interpretation that you see in Montesquieu, which is also, I think, there's that sense of freedom is reiterated in the Divine Comedy by Dante, and then reiterated in the 18th century in a completely different language by Kant with his moral philosophy. And I think that this is what underpins these sort of political projects of the 18th century. And I just think that it's important to note that and to ask ourselves if this kind of sort of corollary, sort of philosophical outlook or whatever is possible for us. And if it's not possible for us, what are the consequences of that politically if we're going to try to keep doing this thing that we're doing or that claim that we're doing?
So you're saying without chastity and continence, we're not gonna.
Not too much, but
creating chastity and continence, but not yet. Without the sense of virtue, we're not gonna be able to really engage in a
I think
democracy.
David's lecture about the barricades in Fifth last year, he talked about the moment when the prostitute got up on the barricades and just
did her dress up.
Did her dress up and she got blasted, right?
And then
another one jumped up right away. And for them, if you ask Robespierre, he would say it was for the homeland, right? Now, we have all sorts of nasty sort of meanings now associated with that word. Thank you, George W. Bush and all those guys, right? But it's something like that. They did that. Their will was unbreakable because
it was the ultimate.
Yeah, right. And if you if the ultimate X is the self understood as that which is already sovereign in the exercise of its desire, then you don't have a lot to work with. That's what I'm saying.
I'm going to bring, I would like to get everybody on the panel into the conversation, and I'm going to bring, let's have 3 questions, and then let's cross across the panel. And I mean, this question of like, what is freedom? I'd love to hear some of the other panelists weigh in on as well. I think first, Leslie, Chris, and then yourself. Kate, thanks. Leslie.
I might be deviating a bit from what is freedom, but I'm not sure because I want to maybe just contribute. This is maybe less of a question, but add to a little bit of what Claire was talking about. Thanks to all the panelists. I think you all did a really great job. And in particular, I think bringing up movements on the left and our approaches to democracy and troubling it, and laying out the 2 sort of kinds of ways in which we approach democracy, one being the rule of the people and the other, less troubled, being how the people shall be ruled. And certainly, we do on the left, I think, have a say in how we will be ruled. I wanted to just contribute something that just because it's been on my mind today. But I guess first, like Matthew, I appreciate that. I think you said, as opposed to democracy being just like an understood good, that it's a mechanism, and certainly I think it changes depending on where we are and when we are. JD and David certainly bring that in so far as bringing up consumerism, capitalism. And JD, I think you said something about democracy now having to do with our say in determining what's done with the wealth that we have a role in generating. And certainly these days, it seems like between elections, the most popular way of exercising your democracy is buying things. So getting back to Claire, I guess the one thing that's been on my mind today is there's been a lot of attention today online in the past couple of days on Occupy Sandy and the Rolling Jubilee, and this movement that people on the left seem to be pretty impressed with about people getting together and buying up debt as a way of supposedly challenging capitalism and the crazy personal debt and foreclosures that happens as a result. This is not my idea, but today Doug Henwood online questioned this Rolling Jubilee thing and said, why are we going and buying up debt for pennies on the dollar? Why aren't we sort of counseling people in how to declare bankruptcy all the while, or making trying to ask for debt forgiveness? Why are we actually going and buying the debt that supposedly these movements on the left are so against? So I just for you in terms of Occupy and the trouble that you had with the General Assemblies being more about administrating than about sort of producing new forms of democracy, this whole sort of Rolling Jubilee buying up debt again seems to be a way of sort of administrating capitalism, even in the left or by the left, as opposed to sort of challenging it or whatever. So I think I just appreciate your comments insofar as on the left, if we want our movements to be actually productive as opposed to administrative, we have to start, thinking in different ways that don't just sort of sign us back up for the very things we're fighting against.
Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, I wanted to. Well, first of all, I thought this was a really good panel. I would say that, as a side note, everyone had much more interesting things to say than Charles Taylor did at King. And none of you got paid $20,000 to do it. So
got a bottle of water.
You got a bottle of smart water, which is nearing. So yeah, I thought that you all had a lot of very interesting things, and I think that I'm interested in Claire's point. I'm interested in 2 things. One is the main thing is sort of Claire's point about this question of whether democracy is a thing we ought to strive for at all, right? And I think that it made me think of a couple things. One is that one can't be in any political movement and oppose democracy openly. You can, but you have to use a language. In the current milieu, it's even people on sort of it's always about preserving an idea of true democracy, right? So there's this sense that it's even people who would advocate for sort of a vanguardist model would call it democratic centralism, right? You would almost have to use the language of democracy. At the same time, that language often means radically different things, right? So the democracy of Occupy is very different than the democracy that would be used to run guess, an independent screen printing collective that's operated at someone's house is very different from the democracy that's talked about by neoconservatives of that sort of Straussian school, which is very different from sort of liberal democracy. Right? But they all use the term democracy, and in a lot of ways, democracy is such an empty term that it's not actually, in some way, it's such an empty term that we fill it with meaning, right? And so that in some ways, like it simultaneously is not harmful to strive for democracy necessarily as such, because it is whatever we want it to be. But at the same time, it's also not helpful in the sense that it is so empty that we're not striving for anything at all. So in some ways, like I think that I'm not sure what to make of it, but it seems like this sort of the emptiness of democracy is simultaneously what makes it sort of a source of hope, but is also in some ways debilitating in the sense that it's not a clear goal to move towards. So like I guess I don't have a clear idea of what that means, other than the fact that it is empty enough that like I think we should talk about it. The other thing I would say is that like there's also this question of, particularly the sort of the later parts of the panel, there was sort of a discussion with, and the earlier questions, discussion of sovereignty, right? So like Hart and Negri talk about this idea that there's like an obsession with sovereignty in political thought right now, right? That it's like, and I think that in some ways I worry that sovereignty is also being used here in the same way that democracy is, in the sense that it's empty, right? That it's the sense that it is, what is it to be sovereign actually is perhaps so unclear that it makes it possible to talk past each other, but also sort of so unclear that like there's room that we could problematize it and find fruitful ground. At the same time, it is perhaps so empty that
it's filled a void, right? It's filled a void on the left that it's been needed since the fall of the Soviet Union.
Right, and so that is like those would be my two suggestions: is that perhaps sort of the emptiness of both terms. I'm not sure what to do with it. That is my question. So what do we do with the emptiness of those terms, guys? All four of you.
Like, did I say respond to that?
I thought we were doing 3.
Oh, 3? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Kate, if you don't mind, let's get, there's a lot in those two questions, and a lot of them get forgotten. So, who would like to start?
It sounds like you're eager.
Yeah, no, that's a huge problem for me, right? The emptiness of democracy. And I think, for me, I think that, like, the reason that, like, there was liberal democracy is that, like, hooking democracy up to this other thing made it something, right? I was reading the 3rd volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty by Friedrich Hayek today, who's well worth reading. When I actually took it upon myself to read him, I was like, holy shit, this guy's been as polarized as bad as Karl Marx. And there's this nice moment where he says, you know, don't we have to say really that democracy presupposes something higher or something other? And it made me think a lot about the fact that something that really grinds me down psychologically or emotionally is the way it seems like democracy is almost, as this word has almost come to fill out the whole horizon of the meaning of life. And we just got through section 2 in foundation year, and we read the Divine Comedy, and it's like, here's a time when democracy is not on the menu as something to be struggled for necessarily or whatever, but there's like courage and love and death and all this other stuff, and it's like imagination, and fidelity, devotion,
linguistic play.
Yeah, yes, and promises and vows and all this awesome shit. And I'm kind of like, can't we talk? Like, isn't anything else real? You know what I mean? And that's sort of my concern, right? And when I was like in Montreal marching with these students, and they were, this is what democracy looks like. I'm like, man, this looks like a whole bunch of shit. And all of it's pretty good, and like, there's love here, and there's like, I don't know, there's we exist. Like, holy shit, we're in the universe and we exist, and we'll never get the answer to what it means, and like. There's so much we can come up with to say about it, and like ways to make ourselves move around and stuff, right? And that's I don't know if that speaks to what your anxiety about the emptiness of this thing is, but it's like, man, there have been human beings for a long time in lots of different places, and they boogied and did their thing, and they fought, and they had stuff happen, and they made things happen, and they had things fail, in some ways, like, this is where the moment where I was afraid I would get verbally stomped down tonight, but like sometimes I just want to be like, fuck democracy. You know what I mean? Just even to get some breathing space, just for a second.
Golden Dawn is applauding.
Yeah, well.
John.
They got elected.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting pointing out that democracy is an empty word, but I think it's actually okay. It recognizes that democracy is something that people have constructed. It literally means people power. So it's about creating the space where we can talk about what we want to do, what we have and what we want to do with it, where we want to go, what is important to us. We need to have that space for decision-making, that space for conversation. Democracy is the facilitation of that. That's really, really vague, I know. And that's, frankly, to me, it's okay. I don't think that democracy in a university compared to democracy in a government, compared to democracy in a workplace, will take very different forms. But as a constellational effect throughout society, you can create even broader form of democracy. If we're talking about creating a space where everyone can have meaningful input, it means that we have some obligations to create those conditions. People need to be able to make informed contributions. People need to know what's going on. And to me, that requires a civil society so that people can have the education to be there, so that they can know how to put forward their ideas, so they can speak to their friends, spread ideas, and implement them. It manifests in the process, it manifests in the institutions, it manifests in the end goals. We're not going to nail down one single definition of democracy because I don't think it's possible. It takes so many different forms, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah, thank you for your
Please.
for your questions. I feel like we're trying to deal with so many things in this conversation. It's a little overwhelming, but I like that we're landing on the question of concepts themselves. And I think if the only thing we get out of this discussion is a sense that concepts are politically ambivalent, I think it will have been a kind of successful evening. And I think that specifically, if we say concepts are politically ambivalent, therefore what is the role of these concepts, then we have to deal with the problem of ideological practice. And so we say, we want to use concepts and use concepts that allow for and use concepts in such a way that we're not just describing the world, we're not just explaining the world, we're trying to describe it. And I think that what activists have done, and I'm speaking not really as somebody who's involved in Occupy Toronto, and I hope I don't give people that impression because I get all kinds of shit at home. But I do think that what has happened with that movement, what happened to a certain extent in Toronto, is that people did say, okay, democracy is what we need to resolve these major problems, and so then we're going to have this democratic forum. And then democracy is what we are, and that is the counterpower against constitutive power. Right? And then what you're doing, in effect, is obscuring the material conditions under which you're organizing. And inevitably, quite rapidly, somebody is like, no, we don't have democracy here because I feel excluded, or we don't have democracy because there is a formal prohibition on X, or whatever that is. But I do think that question of how to proceed politically when you know that there's, the same kind of applies with freedom. I mean, we're talking about freedom, and you were saying, what is freedom? It's like, no concept has a fixed meaning. It changes according to the conditions in which it's used, right? And so as we proceed with organizing work, I think we have to be most wary, and it's the biggest problem, frankly. Like, it's the problem. I'm going to talk about it tomorrow night when we talk about the concept of the local, is this habit on the left to have kind of a religious orientation to certain words that we imbue with meaning that exceeds what they actually mean. And so if that, I think democracy has the same, we are not just democracy, and more importantly, democracy as a concept doesn't help us understand our reality that much better.
David.
Can I say something about Rivera before you go?
Go.
Because you brought up art, and there's a kind of weird, strangely curated show actually at the Art Gallery of Ontario. That's a collection of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo's work. But I do think if people, and I don't know, frankly, very much about art, so this is it's giving you some time to prepare your thoughts. But there is, an unfortunately, small panel about the Diego Rivera's mural, Man Control of the Universe. Is that what it was? The final one was called?
You mean the one that was in the Rockefeller
Yes,
Center?
right, exactly.
That the Rockefellers tore down.
Correct. And and people should know about this event, and you would know about it much more detail than I would.
But remember, the Rockefellers paid to have Rivera put it up.
This was a fascinating intersection of art and politics, because there was this. It was about consumption. It was about having this high-profile muralist come and do this.
Known Marxist.
Known Marxist. And he paints Lenin into the mural, and Rockefeller has a fucking heart attack. And so,
even though the whole mural is about the Marxist agenda, it's the portrait of Lenin that drives him nuts.
yeah. Or at least that's what he reduces it to.
Yes.
But it's like then there's this moment where the content is uncompromising and very deliberate on Rivera's part, and it creates a massive political conflict and opportunity for intervention to talk about things in a North American context, like anti-capitalism and communism, etc. And anyway, I thought it would bring it up in case it's
But if I could play off of that.
Play off of that.
Rivera, in 1938, is the co-signatory to a manifesto on revolutionary art that he co-signs with Leon Trotsky and André Breton, which is basically a defense of avant-garde art practice in opposition to social realism and in opposition to the ivory tower. So my paper is very much in the same tradition of that argument that art, first of all, is essential to radical change and to revolutionary thought. But for art to contribute to this process, it must not just be about content, it must not just be about democracy, and it must not just be about formal issues. And it is very much about dealing with the crisis of representation. And the art world is in such trouble right now, at least in North America. There are some positive signs happening in South America in terms of breaking down the barriers between art and life in a very sophisticated way. But in North America and in Europe, there are tremendous problems. And I would argue that critical art is the canary in the coal mine. And if the canary is near death, that says something about the prospects for progressive change. So the fight of poets, which may seem to be a very esoteric activity and not much related to what's happening in the street, is very much on the front line of going back to your comment about play, linguistics, breaking out of having a lively culture that may not have voting at the ballot box, but it is far more democratic in its everyday life than contemporary society.
Or even if it does have voting at the ballot box, like that is in service of something else. Yeah. That's sort of what I was saying. And we have something that Zizek wrote recently that I really did like was
he does write some good stuff.
Yeah, I love most of his stuff, just to defend myself against the Zizek bashing charge. But
he teased too.
It was teasing.
Of course he's teasing.
But he said that maybe we've changed the world too much in the last 100 years. Maybe it's time to interpret it again. Maybe we need to start thinking again about do we take for granted that we actually know what anything is? You know what I mean? And I think that he means reopening the imagination.
I sympathize with it a lot, actually. And I like Zizek's work and precisely this. I mean, I don't know if we've come to a point in this conversation where we're making strategic recommendations, which I think is far beyond the scope of it. But
I think we're trying to open up the discussion rather than shutting it down.
But insofar, right, and insofar as this is kind of a forum we would all support, I think it's precisely for that reason that we understand political struggle to involve sometimes just deliberating and thinking through how to best describe our conditions as the starting point for coming up with concepts that would help us change things.
Are there any other questions on the floor?
Did you have something? You always do.
Well, I think that do we plan more such panels?
Yes.
I think in future time we should stick to a democracy, but it should be more focused. Tonight, I find that some big questions are raised on which we should focus in the future, like the democratic concept of freedom and capitalism and democracy. Are they compatible? Of course, they are not compatible. But we have to discuss these things and focus on them. Tonight, I have the feeling that the discussion is very unfocused.
I think that was deliberate.
That was on purpose.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. I mean,
yeah, that's it.
One of the things that's interesting in the way that I sort of did not sort of count the conversation taking place is that there's large-scale agreement on the idea that that democracy functions in a way that becomes an obstacle. Like it seems like all of you, maybe JD less so, but JD is very critical of current forms of democracy in specific ways. All of you have a way in which you're almost anti-democrats in a specific sense.
I think this is. I don't know if that's an accurate
No. I don't think. In a very specific sense, and the way that people would take democracy as functioning. Because I think there's a way in which all of you have this notion, have this idea of. The last thing that Matthew said was very interesting to me because there was a sense that in Montreal there was something that could be sensed as being real as opposed to the substitute at the ballot box. It had this feeling of connecting back to this earlier notion of a kind of a virtuous existence, a choice to make, a freedom in the sense of being able to make a decision towards something, actually making a choice. And that seemed to be closer to that concept than the current form of democracy, which seems to be hollow, and just Chris's question of the way in which it seems to expand in the space and make any kind of reconsideration of these categories, what it would look like, very difficult. I think in that sense is that there's a way in which, so that was surprising to me in some sense in how the discussion has come about. But the one thing I did want to sort of bring back into the conversation is, and just maybe starting back with Matthew, is these ideas of freedom. Because there seems to be a way in which there seems to be a difference between how moderns and ancients sort of would conceive of the category of freedom, specifically in this way. It seems like in the ancient notion of democracy, everything was up for consideration politically. Morality would be sort of dealt with at the level of the state. One essay that we often read is Benjamin Constant's essay on freedom of the moderns. And for there, it seems like the state itself is not so much generating morality, it's society is generating it. It's coming up, and that society would be more like a technical question of being able to adjudicate or formalize what civil society already knows. So something like gay marriage is already existing at the level of civil society. The role of the state at that point would be to sort of formalize it. Seems like a very different notion, and that responsibility of freedom is one of indeterminacy. It's the modern notion of freedom is not one in which there's a God at the root of it or some kind of virtue, but it is that choice to determine an open-ended kind of existence that is at the key of modernity, that seems different from the ancient. But in the way that you sort of described in Montreal, the thing that was, thing about Montreal that was so compelling was the way that it sort of struck a chord of love. Rather than sort of this idea of an open-ended, how can we redefine society? How could society be fundamentally different in a way that we've never conceived it before, rather than having some kind of eternal rooting? And it strikes me that one thing about the left is, I think this came up in Claire's talk, ideas of horizontality are as much symbolic and sort of taken for granted as democracy in the ballot box. It's everything, Occupy had to sort of organize in a specific kind of way or nothing would get done. The way in which Claire would sort of point out that things that should have been just technical issues became like the only way that we could conceive of a radical democratic movement in America would have to be one in which we would democratically determine whether we're going to take out the garbage or not, or who's going to do it, or what form it's going to take. And so it seems like this thing that sort of roots it down, that makes it like feels good and sort of a substitute, is almost falling into the exact same trap as like formal democracy. They're both kind of these categories that we can't think past. We get stuck on them. We have to, any left is going to have to organize at the level of democracy at the square. There will be no left, no kind of way in which the left can reconsider that question. It becomes a block almost.
Then why do we have to remain stuck at that? Why do we not try to imagine beyond that?
Yeah, I think that would be the question I'm sort of curious about. And does that have to, and why does that, yeah, to what extent does that?
But we haven't, for me, the question comes back to Marxism again. I mean, we haven't talked enough about that. Why we're living in a kind of post-Marxist, post-revolutionary culture right now. How does the concept of Marx, how does Marx come back in? How does revolution come back in when we're constantly told that the idea of revolution and the ideas of Marx are irrelevant to contemporary capitalist society, that capitalism and democracy are the be-all and end-all of our political culture? I mean, if we don't break out of that, then we're going to get the scenario that you're talking about. That will be the end. Now, one of the problems I see is that when the left tries to formulate a strategy of fighting from within, and you're the most optimistic member of the panel, and I haven't been around this much optimism in a long time, so it's it's kind of cool.
We seem, yeah. I was going to make a Harry Potter reference.
Okay.
You know the Dementors?
But one of the problems with this post-Marxist left is that it's always premised on the idea of things improving over time. That we're going to, once we organize these democratic forces, there is this inherent belief that we are moving towards a more just and more democratic society. I mean, isn't that the essence of why you do this? That you are going to make things better for people. Well, what is the concept of time you are functioning with here? That is a linear, progressive notion of time. What is the ultimate essence of the concept of time functioning within Western bourgeois society? How can you create a democratic, just society in opposition to the unjust forces arrayed against you if your concept of time is already part and parcel of the concept of time of this dominant culture? You're already functioning within the hegemon. You cannot escape it. You are not actually resisting that culture. It seems to me that one of the reasons why the right is such a threat right now is because they are not caught in the same dilemma. They do not have to worry about this. Time is on their side, metaphorically speaking. They can play with narratives. They can play with linearity. They can run with the system. Our hands are tied behind our backs.
Because of urgency?
Because every time we try to break out of the trap, the way we construct our progressive notions of change are already within the logic of the system. So if we assume that our notion of a better society is going to be within the system, that's fine. If we define the good system as within capitalism, that's fine. But if for those of you here that think that there's something inherently problematic with justice being achieved within capitalism, and then we have to begin to imagine outside of capitalism, and then Marx comes back into the equation, then we have to rethink the relationship between space and time. The postmoderns tried to do this. The postmoderns said time is an inherently modern concept. We reject Marxism because it is a linear philosophy. We are going to reintroduce space. Spatiality will be the true way to build resistance to the depredations of modernity. Well, how far did that get us? It didn't get us anywhere. So now we're caught. We come back to a binary. Space, time, both of these concepts are linked to flawed strategies. So if that's true, how do you build a democratic progressive politics in opposition to capitalism when these dimensions of being are caught within the system.
JD and then Claire.
Well, the people who say that Marxism is no longer relevant are wrong. Marx is still relevant, and Marx offers some very interesting analysis. Marxism, I would say, not necessarily just Marx. Marxism is not based on progression towards a final state of society in existence. It's based on the idea that history is a series of cause and effect as a result of relations between groups of people that have different relations to how production happened in society. So history hasn't naturally gone from feudalism to capitalism and will go to communism. That's just how it has happened. That's how it has happened, minus the communism part. So if we're looking at finding ways to make it better, finding ways to move past capitalism, which I think we need to do.
So there is a linear component because you're going to move past capitalism.
Only to a certain extent, but I'm not saying the end of history is after capitalism. What I'm saying is
But you're moving forward.
Yes, we need to put forward a goal. Sure.
But that's my point.
Democracy is the means to get there.
But that's the point. That was the problem with the Second International. If you begin to think, as the social democratic movement did at the end of the 19th century, that you can reform capitalism from within in a linear trajectory of moving forward to something better without revolution, then there's no reason why that isn't compatible with capitalism.
But, sorry, just to clarify, because I think this is complicated.
Yeah,
stuff.
definitely.
Are you suggesting that revolution is the defiance of linear time?
No, because unfortunately the way revolutions have worked in the last 150 years, they've also been predicated on linear time. So part of coming back to the question of imagination is trying to break out of the trap of this binary logic of space and time. Because both moderns and postmoderns have oscillated back and forth between these two concepts.
I don't understand.
Really
there seems to be only two ways of going about that. You're saying that revolution relies on a linear path, which is getting beside the point. So we need to build an alternative, which would then overthrow. But that is itself say we can produce alternatives within the system. The alternative is just to go with revolution.
Listen. Postmodernism tried to break out of these meta-narratives, which were based on this notion, either revolution or liberal notions of linear time, that we're moving towards a glorious new future that was going to be better. Postmodernism said these are meta-narratives that are universalizing and inherently unjust. So we have to get rid of this idea of linear time and focus on change happening in space. That time itself was an oppressive characteristic of Western capitalism. But after 30 or 40 years, the kind of progressive change that this was supposed to usher in didn't happen. And now the left is kind of caught with, well, we know the problems with linear time and revolution, but we know the problems with focusing on space doesn't exactly bring about the progressive change we want either. So I'm not advocating revolution as the answer. I'm saying that there's a problem with the ideas of socialism and social democracy and revolution as we've experienced them in the last 150 years. Which is why I go back to the comment I made about why we're vulnerable to the right leaping by us in this battle, is that our hands are tied in the way we conceive of dealing with this current epoch. We're worse off now than we were in the 30s or before World War I. So I share a lot of your melancholia.
I'm the happiest dude I know.
All right. I do want to wrap this up in the next 10 minutes. There is a question. Is there anybody else who has Chris? Let's maybe get a series of quick questions in here or comments.
Okay, this is kind of related to what you were just discussing, but I guess it's something like Jacques Derrida who really brought in the conversation about deconstruction and these binaries not being stable. Is that a way to get out of this trap, or is it?
Well, he was the one that was breaking down the binary argument to get out of the trap.
Yeah.
But then people get very dissatisfied with the lack of solutions within his method.
Yeah.
Right. So we end up in the 21st century surrounded by a mess. Mm-hmm. And we're all up here saying, well, how do we fight this? How do
Yeah.
we create these solutions of trying to make things better for everyone from our perspective? And yet we have to learn from the past. We don't want to just repeat the mistakes of the past. And one of those mistakes is we lost several times to the right. And we outnumbered, like the left outnumbered the right in the 1930s. How did that happen? And I'm going to let you in on a secret. We don't outnumber them now. There isn't an organized communist party or an organized socialist party of the numbers in North America that existed in Germany in the 1930s. We are going to be beaten in this unless we begin to think outside of the box that I've just described that we're trapped in. Or do we just continue to play this broken record over and over again until the economic crisis and the reemergence of the right does it to us all over again? So I'm just trying to I want to get people upset. I want people to think about this, because we do not have till the end of time to think about how are we going to have a more democratic future.
We could have a more democratic future and a right future, is the problem. Or
That's what we want.
Sorry?
That's what we want.
It's what we want?
You mean a right-wing future?
Yes.
Oh, that's,
Right.
yeah, we don't want that.
Right.
Yes, we could have a democratic right-wing future.
I mean, I don't know what, did you want to do another question?
Chris, Claire, can you hold your thought, and then we'll do that and we'll finish up. Okay.
I was going to, I don't want to speak more than Claire does. She's actually on the panel. I guess one of the problems is, like, I think I want to sort of, as we were to close it, sort of like bring it back to something slightly, in some ways slightly more concrete in the sense of sort of question of organizing. Which is that I do think the problem is like Marxism, right? And like, I think the problem though is Marxism, like one of the problems with democracy is like Marxism in sort of a more historical practice, in the sense that part of the problem we live in is not the fall of the Soviet Union per se, that the left is like constantly in the shadow. It's not necessarily the fall of the Berlin Wall, but rather Stalinization, right? In the sense that it's like not just the Stalinization of the Soviet Union itself, because by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, it was already sort of authoritarian and dictatorial, but the way in which the experience of the left in North America and in Europe outside of the Soviet Union was one of the Stalinization by the Communist International, Comintern, of national communist parties, right? So the 1960s, the New Left is sort of a reaction against that process of Stalinization, in the sense that it's this turn towards sort of direct democracy or whatever else. There's a return to this sense, reacting against that in terms of the new communist movement, we return to sort of vanguard of politics again. By the time we arrive at sort of the 90s and even the 2000s, so sort of the anti-globalization movement stuff, but also sort of the key defining characteristic of Occupy in a lot of ways was this concept of this new obsession with prefigurative politics, right? And I do want to sort of ask for sort of opinions on that in the sense that it's like, and JD like brings this up in a way that I think is really problematic in the sense that it's like this idea that democracy is how we get there. And then is this sense of like one of the defining characteristics in my mind that was this huge problem, which was why like I had a very similar experience with Occupy Nova Scotia, as I feel like you're describing to Occupy Toronto, is this sense that like you encounter it and that it's like democracy itself becomes, they're saying, so empty that it's fetishized, but it's that to be prefigurative is taken as axiomatic, right? That like we must be democratic in everything we do in order to do anything else. And whatever anything else is, we can't even talk about until we're democratic. And I wonder if that is the degree to which, then you like your thoughts on the value of prefigurative politics. That is, like in its worst form, that be the change you want to see in the world, but also in its sort of like Occupy form of an obsession with a certain set of assumptions about consensus-based democratic principles.
Okay, with this we're going to wrap up, so we'll go, everybody will have a chance to respond to this, and we'll begin with Claire. I'm so sorry for interrupting you, Claire, on that last thought.
Now I'm a little scattered. Does anybody want to go first? Okay, well, I'll just fall through my comments. Thank you. I'm similarly concerned by the popularity of prefigurative politics. I think that it was popular with the anti-globalization movement too. And what you have, I it's hard because I have no sense of the audience and what even is really happening in Halifax, so it's hard to come up with questions that are rooted in things that would happen here. But I feel like my exposure is to a lot of activism that is subcultural, and it's like its primary social practice is the preservation of constituted groups, rather than the existence of like political alliances that are then trying to transform and produce new things in the world. And that's a very pessimistic assessment, and I'm sure I would offend many people with it. But it's the kind of hostility that I think is necessary if we want to do something new. And I think in terms of doing something new, there are a few things pertaining to Occupy and pertaining to this question of prefigurative politics and pertaining to this question of how fucked we are. And that's the distinction between latent politics and manifest politics. So you pretty boldly asserted that the left is outnumbered, but I don't actually think we have statistics on this. Like, there's no Gallup poll on how many people identify with socialism in this country. It just doesn't. I'm not saying that we would get the results we want, or that numbers are the only question. Sorry.
Go to Nick Nanos, I heard he's left leaning.
But I think that we would do well to imagine that the activism we need is much more demanding in every respect than what we currently do, and that's precisely because it involves the work of, and I think art has a tremendous role in this, connecting with the latent content of people's anger and discontent, and not just the manifest content. So I don't just mean like not preaching to the converted, but not appealing to people on the basis of ideology. Right. And it's really difficult. It's really difficult work, and I guess that's where I'll conclude my comments. I did want to say one thing. It's more of a question because I know Jody Dean has written a book about democracy, and I'm wondering if anybody read it.
Is it not the recent one, The Communist Horizon?
No, there was one before that specifically about democracy, which is supposed to be very good. And actually, when I was preparing for this and didn't have time to read it, I was bummed. The proposal that we start taking concepts like communism as the strategy for pushing things is an interesting one. It's complicated. You don't connect to latent content necessarily by opening with this huge word, but because nobody said it, I guess I'll throw it out there. That's one thing with these groups.
Talk about prefigurative politics and the fact that democracy is an an empty word that means whatever the heck we want it to mean, isn't the end of the world. I don't know, if we're trying to make the world a better place, presumably we want democracy. If we don't, we have some very important discussions to have.
Shall we come back to you? Collect your thought. Matthew, did you want to? I know sort of like it just kind of the question that it lands on you as like final remarks. So I have to. I don't want to put you in the exact same position now.
Yeah. I mean, for me, there are certain things that are keeping anything from moving. One of which is like, the thing that irritates me the most about Stephen Harper is not that he's being a jerk or like being undemocratic and slashing all these institutes. It's that he's telling you that he's not doing it. And he knows that you know that he's doing it. And what I mean by that is that he is blocking you from effectively setting up an actual opposition where he's the fucking enemy. And you're his enemy. And it's not nice to live in times like that. Everybody knows that, right? And one of the, like I said before, if you go to war against the bad sovereign, it sets up all these epistemological problems, right? Or like, is it the time, right? Think about Weimar, right? Here come the Nazis. They're going to get elected. What do? Do we suspend the Constitution now and institute martial law?
With 33% of the vote.
Yeah, right? And, or do we wait for them to come in and get elected and then suspend it. So the question for Hobbes is like, are you going to be the one that's going to pull the trigger and be the one that started the war, or are you going to wait for it to happen? And like, once this moment happens, all bets are off. There's no more calculability of anything. Things get ugly, right? But that's a fact of life. Like, human beings have put up with that for a long time, and it feels like we're in this kind of holding pattern where we know there are ugly things looming all in the shadows and all around us waiting to happen, right? But they're not. They're being prevented from happening. And I think for me, the beginning of like facing up to all of the really difficult tasks that are ahead of us and our children is to find a way of like unblocking that. That's how I feel about it. I don't know how to do that.
Peter, are you ready to?
I'm just a comment that look what's happening to the universities. Talking about attacks on democracy, humanities departments being cut, philosophy departments being closed all over Western Europe, art colleges being underfunded when we talk about the importance of the arts. When Stephen Harper's leading that assault in Canada, these are all things that are cutting the taproot of a critical citizenry.
And then he says, I like the arts. I play a little piano.
I'll tell you that the premier of this province really likes the arts too, as he cuts our funding. So they'll tell you to your face what they like. That doesn't change what the policy direction is. So based on what I was saying earlier, if poetry, if the visual arts are the Canadian coal mine, and you know the history of coal mining in this province. If I was working in Westray, I would get out of there before it went. But where do you go in this world now? Where would you go if North America went, as George Bush said, if this sucker could go down? Where would you go? Probably the last place where democracy will be defended. I put my bets on India as a place to probably retreat to, because it won't be Western Europe. But that's how I think. I think our generation has no experience with this kind of horror and where things could go, and no one has talked about. We've all focused on the left so much. We never talk about what the right is doing, and we don't understand how we're being outmaneuvered. We never really analyze. How did the right succeed when the left? Remember before World War I how powerful the left was, the trade union movement, the social democratic movement? There will never be a world war because it's not in the capitalist interest or in the workers' interest to go to war. But they were unable to stop the war. The left was unable to stop Hitler. Well, why are we going to be any different? What are we doing different that will ensure our success? I don't see us doing anything different.
Okay, I feel like I'm almost obligated to give an optimistic counter, even if it's not right.
As long as you're saying how you're doing something different from what we've done in the past.
It's an important discussion. I think it's been a really interesting panel, and it's raised a lot of uncomfortable questions, which is probably a healthy sign. Democracy means people power in its most literal form, and that means it's a social thing. It's based on engagement. It's not a singular thing based on my freedom. I think that is one of the flaws of the attempt to create consensus-based democracy and Occupy, which is based on we're all equal, we're all just members of the 99%. That's not how it works. There's always power, and you need to be able to call out power and have this relationship. That's what makes democracy. And so I'm going to go back to my original points. Democracy is how we organize ourselves to create those better conditions. Democracy is the condition we want to create, where we have this informed and meaningful engagement in how we administer and use what we have. It is not the way the world currently is. It's deeply undemocratic, the way we have our economy structured. This needs to be challenged. And I'm very nervous for the future. I see things getting worse faster than they're getting better. But only through optimism can we get there. Like, we have to fight this and we have to win it. We only have, 50 years before the ecosystems collapse, if that. Like, when do you start having a little optimism? Thanks.
Thank you very much, and a round of applause for our If anybody's interested in continuing, I am, for one, I'm going for a drink.
Marxism?
Something a little